Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Henny van As. I'm a professor of public law at the Nelson Mandela University, and I'm also head of the FishFORCE Academy, which is a project that was started in 2016 and funded by the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This morning we're going to have a look at anti-corruption in the fisheries environment, but we're going to take it a little bit wider. But before I get there, I need to draw your attention to a number of courses that we developed with the funding from the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, including the law for inspectors and fisheries control officers, species identification, the gear used in fisheries. The species identification and the gear are directly also linked to corruption, because these are the different types of fish are sold off as another species that is not as strictly controlled, and sometimes the illegal gear is used to fish illegally. We also found that there's a dire need for capacity to write proper statements so that cases are not thrown out by the court. So we developed that course. We developed an anti-corruption one, which we run with the taking of statements. Fisheries trade monitoring, I'm not going to read all of it. Fisheries trade monitoring is also linked to corruption, because if one look at the amount of a particular species arriving in market states and you compare it with the volume of marine living resources that leave a particular country, you can determine the extent of the illegal harvesting that is taking place or the underreporting that is taking place. And of course, we follow a rights-based approach, so that we honor the basic rights of everybody. We are also working with the UNODC Education for Justice, or E4J project, and they developed 9 modules, which you can see on the screen now. And the Nelson Mandela University was appointed to offer 5 of those modules in South Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, and Mauritius. And we will embark on that shortly. So the question is, and this is the angle that I like to approach it, is where does corruption start? And for me, corruption starts with where there's a lack of ethics and where there's a lack of professionalism. So linked to anti-corruption is, how do we increase ethical conduct and ethical environment, ethical institutions, and how do we increase the professionalism of people that work in these environments? As an introduction, I'm going to have a look at certain concepts, which I'm showing you on the screen now, just so that we have this as a background and to understand some of the issues that we will be addressing. If we look at hypocrisy, it is a state of pretending to have beliefs, opinions, virtues, feelings, or standards that one does not actually have. It is a kind of a lie. For an example, even alcoholic is advocating temperance. Would it be considered to be an act of hypocrisy? Not necessarily, as long as this person does make no pretense of constant sobriety. In other words, he's not saying, I don't drink at all, in the meantime he's drinking. And then we are often in the law enforcement environment, we are faced with ethical dilemmas. What should we do, and what will be the right thing to do? If we look at this picture, it was taken many years ago, where a monk in Tibet sets himself alight because of the Chinese invasion of Tibet. And on the top left, in front of the car, one see another monk who is in this ethical dilemma. Shall I save my colleague and then lose the impact of a person killing himself, or shall I let him die for a higher cause? These are ethical dilemmas that practitioners often face. I find a person in possession of 1 or 2 fish that is not supposed to be in possession. Do I arrest this person and issue a fine and at the same time take food out of people's mouth? So these are ethical dilemmas that people often sit with. And one of the problems that we also have is nepotism. And I think this picture speaks for itself, where the interviewee says, I'm highly motivated, outgoing and independently minded. Isn't that right, Dad? Now, if we look at the definition of ethics, if ethics are principles that guide behavior with regard to what is right, good, and what is proper, it sets standards to achieve what is right, good, and proper, and it's sustained efforts. We continuously employ the principles and the standards and ethical standards for the benefit of the public. And I find this picture quite nice. The question is, how important are ethics in today's society? But everybody is around this author is cheating. Types of unethical behavior includes laziness, carelessness. This person painted the road marking around the branch. He will not pick it up because it's not his job. Waste of resources, abuse of assets, and disrespect for the public and the interests. I often walk into offices where there's a poster of our mission, our vision, and Ubuntu, etc. In the meantime, or at the same time, the person that's supposed to help you, and this happened to me twice now, sits and eat something and drink something and is not in the least worried about the people that sit waiting. That is total disrespect for the public and the interest. Now, behavior concerning dishonesty include things like corruption, theft, graft, fraud, insider knowledge. We now recently had in South Africa the case of a big company, Steinhoff, that is under the cosh, and over the weekend it came to light that the ex-CEO of the company used insider knowledge to warn certain people to sell their shares. Self-dealing, people contracting with themselves, personal use of government property, and where people find additional employment. I've encountered law enforcement officers that moonlight over a weekend for the cash in transit companies without their employers knowing about this. People contracting with themselves, or law enforcement officers that offer their services to ranching companies, Abalone ranching companies, for example. And in their spare time, they conduct a security function there. Now, one of the ways in which to increase or to fight corruption is to be professional. And the characteristics are that professionals are considered to be experts. They have a high degree of knowledge with a theoretical base. This is what we're doing through the FishFORCE project. We are adding to that theoretical base. Apart from the practical part of training that we offer, it is very important that people must have a good theoretical base. Professionals are orientated not towards themselves, but towards the public, and they can control themselves. Where often I have seen videos where fisheries control officers are taunted by the public, and they have to exercise self-control because the consequences can be severe. The reward system is not always found in money, but in their achievements. And professionals normally have a system of testing the competence of members of the profession. For example, if we look at medical professionals, they have to do certain continuous professional development, earning certain points per year. And there's nothing that stops any other profession from implementing minimum academic requirements, minimum experience and then continuous testing of the competence by the organization itself. Added competencies include problem solving and the ability to apply the theory to the practice, and enthusiasm, and then of course recognizing the need for continuous learning, because things change quickly. We've recently, in this year, we received a number of requests on, and it's new technology that's used. For example, drones. People use drones to take bait out to the sea. So very often the technology develops faster than the law can develop, and so the law have gaps. But this is just a confirmation of the need for continuous learning. Now, there's a link between ethical individuals and ethical organizations. Organizations with high ethical values will attract and retain ethical individuals, but the leadership is critical. The leadership must set the standards. You'll see there's a note where I talk about a stealing daughter. It's a story that I've heard many years ago, where the father was informed that he must come and get his daughter in primary school because she's stealing everything that she can lay her eyes on. Paper clips, pens, pencils, rulers, erasers. And he picked up, and as they drove home, he said to her, "My child, if you wanted these things so badly, why didn't you just tell me and I would have brought it to you from work?" Now, that's the example that's set by the leadership. We can just ask ourselves, what is the moral view of ethical behavior in the public sector? In South Africa at the moment, we sit with the Zondo Commission, and every day people become more and more wound up about what's going on and what they're hearing. And we must just ask ourselves, what is the view of the public sector of employees? What do they think of us? Now, organizational responses to unethical behavior often regulations. They set standards of conduct. If we look at the different types of legislation, there's a code of conduct for government employees, there's a code of conduct for municipal employees, a code of conduct for councillors. And then in every business and every government department, we go in and say, there's our corporate values. Is it just an exercise that gets a poster, or do we live according to those values? And then the organizations set in place certain control measures, and they include management and governance systems. And if people transgress the organization's ethical prescriptions, sanctions are often imposed. What is expected of me? Loyal execution of policies. Perform my functions in good faith, honestly and transparently. Act in the best interest of my employer so that I don't compromise my credibility. And then, of course, to act impartially and without favor of prejudice. There's a big thing about personal gain. I had a discussion with a person from another country a number of years ago, and he was working in South Africa, and he said to me, he doesn't understand this whole thing of bonuses. He said, one gets a salary to do your job 100%. So, and he was surprised about this thing that we all think we are entitled to bonuses. Now, staff members may not use their position or information for personal gain. They sit on tender bodies or they advertise a tender, but for 3 or 4 days doesn't give the normal tenderers a reasonable time to submit and prepare, etc. Staff members may not take decisions on matters which their spouse, partner, or business partner has a direct or indirect interest, may not be a party to a contract for the provision of goods or performance of work without consent, may not have financial interest in business and be engaged in any business, trade or profession if they don't have the consent. I know at the university, for example, every year we have to apply for permission to do other work. For example, scientists that want to do other work in the law faculty, we often practice as attorneys or advocates, but you have to get official permission to do that. Brings us to the question, what is corruption? There's no international legal definition, but for our purpose, corrupt activities include things like bribery, extortion, fraud, deception, collusion, money laundering. Kierkegaard is one of the foremost authors on corruption theory, and he has a recipe. I'm going to give you a minute or 30 seconds to think if you can get the answer to the three pictures there. It starts on the left and it gives us an answer as to what is the recipe for corruption. Right, it's a fast minute. But according to Kierkegaard, he says monopoly plus a discretion with no accountability will result in corruption. In other words, if you give in the fisheries environment somebody the monopoly to decide over rights allocations or permits or whatever the case, and if there is no accountability, there will be corruption. We can make an analogous case for many other environments. If we look at local government in South Africa at the moment, for a long time, there was no accountability. It's now that it's starting to hold people accountable. We are currently busy with a project with Salga on an accountability framework for municipalities. Monopoly plus discretion minus any accountability equals corruption. The stark realities of corruption, I'm just going to mention a few things. I'm not going to read it to you, but in Nigeria, some officials of Halliburton agreed to pay $559 million as fines because it ran a bribery ring so that they could get a $6 billion Nigerian project. Between 1994 and 2012, South Africa lost $80 billion US. You will see that I converted it into rand because that number of zeros baffles me. It is a lot of zeros. If you look at the bottom point, 20% of all government procurements go missing each year. I think I missed a few zeros in the top one, but it's still a lot. If we think of what is a billion, we talk about 1 billion, 2 billion here, but a billion seconds ago it was 1959. A billion days ago no one walked the earth on 2 feet, and a billion rand ago it takes government 27 hours and 12 minutes to spend it. With the $80 billion that was lost between 1994 and 2012, we could have built 14.9 million houses. We wouldn't have had a backlog. If we pack 100 rand notes end to end, start in the center of Cape Town, we will end up in Pretoria, and that's $1 billion. Now, I'm not going to go into this in much depth, but the forms of corrupt activities includes bribery. We must remember there are things like active bribery and passive bribery. Passive bribery is the receipt, active bribery is the giving of the benefit. Embezzlement of theft. That's by a person entrusted with authority and they steal the money. Fraud, making of false pretenses. Extortion. I hear this morning on the radio, there's a big thing about extortion in Cape Town, where gangs are charging businesses protection fees. Abuse of power. We've heard this now often in the Zondo Commission. People were instructed by others to do certain things. A conflict of interest, where people are in relationships. Favoritism, and then nepotism we've already touched upon. If we see pictures like this, it says you're not allowed to stop for your own safety, but right next to it there's an emergency telephone. Somebody didn't think. Waste of resources. Somebody got paid for the road traffic sign, and somebody got paid for the emergency telephone. Corruption impacts severely on service delivery. We see that every day. It lowers economic growth. It reduces incentives to invest. It reduces the effective flow of aid packages. About 15 years ago, I had a meeting with an international donor in Cape Town. And the first question that I was asked is, why is the Eastern Cape so corrupt? And I couldn't give any answer. Needless to say that merely because we were a university situated in the Eastern Cape, we lost the possible aid grant that we could have gotten at that time. Loss of tax revenue, adverse budgetary consequences. If you misspend, misappropriate funding, central government will be loath to allocate funding. We see this in the city where I live now. There's a big amount of money that Treasury doesn't want to give to the city unless certain things are put in place. And who's suffering? Those who need it most. Inferior public infrastructure and also the allocation of government expenditure. If we look at this picture, this is the effect of corruption. Somebody signed off on that project. And somebody certified that the job was done properly. Just another picture where an official says, if they took all your money, without money, how are we going to conduct the investigation? It's a subtle or a not so subtle message. You need to pay me if you want me to investigate the matter. This is a picture that was taken of a reconstruction and development project houses that was also signed off as fit for human habitation and that the money was properly spent. Some of the effects of corruption includes pollution. If we look at certain water courses, our beaches, our seas, living conditions. Now, some indicators of possible corrupt activities include high personal debts, living beyond one's means. You will see the picture of the black Maserati there. About 5 or 6 years ago, I was working in the Northern Cape, in the Kalahari, and in the parking lot of a municipality, I saw a black Maserati. And knowing the levels of payment of these small municipalities, immediately lit up a red light. How can anybody that works for a salary like that own a Maserati? Some of these things are difficult to detect. High personal debts in many instances are personal things, but opulence is something that is difficult to hide. Excessive gambling and drug or alcohol abuse can be an indicator. I don't say it's always. Expression of feelings of being underpaid. I remember doing a workshop about 2 years ago one of the coastal towns in South Africa. And at tea time, everybody was moaning about the unfair overtime allocation. This one got so many hours and only got this so much. Complaining about insufficient recognition for job done all the time. Close association with suppliers, golf and fishing trips, holidays together. People not wanting to take vacations. They're scared somebody might see something. Keeping others away. This is my work. This is what I do. I don't want any interference. I will visit. I will do the inspections in that particular area. You don't go. And then undisclosed conflict of interest. Now, to address corruption and deal with the perpetrators, there are 6 steps required. When a complaint or information is received or it is detected, that complaint must be dealt with care. It must be kept close to the investigator's heart, and it must be made available in terms of the policies of the institution where the complaint originates from. The investigators must gather sufficient evidence, and once this evidence shows indications of corruption, disciplinary proceedings must be started immediately. Why do institutions wait for criminal proceedings to start before they start with the disciplinary proceedings? The evidentiary weight in a disciplinary proceeding is very much different from that in a criminal case. And once sufficient evidence is there, prosecution must take place. There's this tendency where corruption is detected, people resign, and then the problem goes away. In many instances, the employer is so glad that they don't pursue matters further. This should not be the case. Employers can accept a resignation or refuse to accept it. Prosecutions must result. Justice must be seen to be done, and people should not be allowed to benefit from corruption. So recovery must take place. And the reason why perpetrators must be dealt with is illustrated by the next one. If we look on the left, most people are willing to do the right thing, so we must make it easy for them. If we say you need a permit to fish, it must be easy to go and get a permit. The next tier of people try to do the right thing, but they don't always succeed. They must be assisted to become compliant. That's where the vision and mission and the Ubuntu and of the institution must come to the fore. If people have a problem, we assist them to comply. Then you have a third tier of people that are involved themselves in IUU fishing. They don't want to comply, but they will if the agencies pay attention. That's where it becomes important, because they need to be detected in order to force them to become compliant. And then you have the fisheries crime tier, which involves organized crime. These are people that they've decided they won't comply with any law. And this is where the full force of the law needs to be used. In other words, the drugs, the gun running, human trafficking, everything that is involved with linked with the fisheries, the full forces of the law must be used. Look, if we get a person with a couple of fish, let me use the following example. If we get a person with a bag of abalone in the southwestern Cape, has that person removed that abalone for personal consumption? That abalone is going somewhere. It's part of a bigger organized criminal syndicate. And that is where the full force of the law, the criminal law, the POCA legislation, and people need to be investigated and charged with organized crime. For example, on the West Coast, we often read about thousands and thousands of crayfish or West Coast rock lobster that's been removed illegally, and a fine is imposed. What do you want to do with 1,500, 2,000 crayfish tails? They are going somewhere where people are selling them and they are consumed. I think about 2 years ago, it was classic to me, where containers full of illegal cigarettes, not containers, chest freezers full of illegal cigarettes are transported and detected near the West Coast. Those chest freezers are going back to Gauteng with something else. That's why it's important to use the full force of the law and investigate these criminal syndicates. It's been known since the 80s that the triads are involved in South Africa, for example. The fishery sector is very vulnerable to corruption, and some of the reasons include the fact that it's global. All countries are involved in some degrees in fishing and exporting or importing with fish. And if there's corruption in one part of the fishing industry, it has a ripple effect across the globe. If we look at what happened years ago in Somalia, a lot of overfishing, and eventually a lot of Somalians turned to piracy. The piracy affected the transport of oil and of other commodities. Fisheries resources are finite and they deplete quickly. And where quotas become involved, people are more willing to engage in corruption so that they can get an advantage. There's a lack of transparency, which registries are not open. And we're dealing with different types of behavior here. For example, some organized crime criminals are seeking the veneer of legitimacy. For example, Bengus, a case that we had in South Africa, he made considerable asset investments to underpin their operations. Big buildings in Hout Bay, built schools, built a university, and they focus on catching and selling low-value, high-volume species. In Bengus' case, it was West Coast rock lobster. In other cases, the behavior is, in other words, the behavior one, the seeking the veneer of legitimacy, it was a company, it's open, it's registered, but in the back, they were selling, they were not fully declaring produce that were landed, etc. The second behavior is hiding from authority, and this is where organized syndicates often target high-value, low-volume products such as abalone, totoaba, and sturgeon. Behavior 3, in certain, if I give you something, am I hospitable or is it corruption? In certain small island states, for example, if a vessel docks and the official must come and inspect the catch, it is traditional to offer fish to inspectors. So it's a fine line that often has to be tread. And on the right of the screen, you will see, for further reading, you can have a look on the UNODC website. And there's a publication called Rotten Fish, which contains a guide on addressing corruption in the fishery sector. Here I've listed a number of typologies of corruption, which can assist us to recognize the patterns of behavior. Information sharing. Police or law enforcement agency give notice to syndicates or smugglers or poachers that certain patrols or inspections are going to take place. Logistic networks can get corrupted, where bribed officials assist to move illegally caught fish and make it legal. Abalone and certain other species leaving South Africa, going to countries like Lesotho and Zimbabwe, where they get legalized. And they've gone through the logistic networks, and it arrives in the market states with documents. Corrupt licensing payments. Fish rot in Namibia is an example. Inspectors that are corrupt, where they misreport the value or the quantity of produce that were landed. Syndicates ingrain themselves with communities. They pay school fees. They form something akin to a parallel government. They build things that the community can use. And in instances, there's also a corrupt maintenance of overinvestment. For example, a company has built big processing plants. There's a reduction in quotas, but the upper level of operation and the level of investment carries on. And then it's possible that the company found illegal ways to increase its profits or to maintain its levels of investment. The approval of seafood certificates. If quality certificates need to be issued, we must check whether particular officials have full control. There must be a system of checks and balances. Here is an example of a corruption at the fishing stage where it's State versus Sibongile Mpofu and a number of others, where a police official was allegedly had a reputation for being corrupt, and he was offered money, and he worked with the director of public prosecutions, and eventually the bribers were charged, and the leaders received 12 months imprisonment for illegal fishing and possession of abalone, and 6 years for corruption. Now, look at if we address it as organized crime, the illegal fishing resulted in a 12 months imprisonment, but the corruption resulted in 6 years. If we compare the top to the bottom of the product and financial value chain of legitimate fisheries at the top and illegitimate fisheries at the bottom, then you will see at the top line the money in the illegitimate value chain. The money always has a way of coming back, of going back somewhere to somebody in the value chain, or it is diverted from the value chain to somebody else. If this is just an example of what one should consider when conducting risk assessments. The presentation will be made available, as Michael said at the beginning, and I'm not going to go through it in full. It gives us a nice picture of how we must go about to see whether our risk assessment controls are sufficient or not. So the question is, how should we address it head on? There's no pussyfooting about. We need to address the causes, and the causes include a lack of transparency and lack of accountability mechanisms. When fishing allocations are made, it must be transparent, and every action should include accountability mechanisms. We must address the lack of effective deterrence. There's a case that involved huge quantities of abalone, where the culprits would most probably have received quite a light sentence, but because there was a little bit of drugs involved, the sentence was much higher. We must address the fact that society often don't see corruption as a problem. Somebody told me the other day that it's not strange when people are at a social function to talk about how they are working with certain government institutions to enrich themselves. We need to address low or irregular pay. There's a perception that certain corrupt behaviors are victimless and they don't have serious consequences. If we don't protect our marine living resources, and if we look at the number or its contribution to any country's GDP, and we look at the number of people that are reliant on the sea for food, there is no victimless. It's not a victimless transgression. Somebody suffers somewhere. We must address this whole conflict of interest, and we need to have a strong judiciary. There must be no weak judicial independence. It must be strong and independent. It's often said in international literature that the lack of personnel, equipment and training is also a problem, and that this lack of personnel, equipment and training make it harder to detect and prosecute corruption officials. Really? Must you really be trained not to be corrupt? Everybody has these two guys on their shoulders. We know when we are doing something wrong, even if we have had no training. There are some strategies that need to be implemented to address corruption. Laws must be clarified. Very often they are written in obscurity. From the last two FishFORCE strategic conversations, we had Advocate Martin Leroux twice explaining the links that has to be established in terms of the Prevention of Organized Crime Act. It is intricate. Laws must be disseminated broadly to judges, prosecutors, wildlife enforcement personnel and the public. For the past 2 years, myself and Phil Snyman have worked with regional court magistrates, where we talk about the impact of IUU fishing and fisheries crime on the marine living resources. And I was quite surprised at the high percentage of senior magistrates that were not aware of this. Corruption is criminalized in most countries. Activities that undermine attempts for illegal fisheries trades, like permit conditions violations, very important. In Seychelles, they check the conditions of permits. There must be clear sentencing guidelines. We often see this disparity in sentences. We had a case in the Eastern Cape and a case in the Western Cape that were very, very similar in terms of quantity, number of people involved, the relationships between the people that were involved. In the Western Cape, a suspended sentence was handed down, and in the Eastern Cape, it was 12 years. The penalties for possession of certain things must be increased. The legislation must target the right people. I sometimes get the impression that we target the little people that are sometimes doing things to stay alive and to provide. But there's no doubt that international organized criminals are involved in our marine living resources depletion and poaching, and they are motivated by profit, not by staying alive and surviving. And then corrupt activities and wildlife crime, including fisheries crime, should be seen as serious crimes. I've been advocating this for at least 2 to 3 years, and it's recent that crime in the marine living environment is being seen as serious crime. Anti-corruption units should be established, and there should be better multi-sectoral dialogue. In other words, customs must work with fisheries officers, must work with police, with crime intelligence, with the state security agents. Because if you look at certain of these things, it's also a threat to state security. And then law enforcement officers and prosecutors must work closer together. It's too often that prosecutors are overwhelmed by dockets. They don't have a background of this type of cases. They've never prosecuted it before, but there are law enforcement officers that are quite experienced and that can assist them in this. Now, putting preventative measures in place, there's a three-pronged approach: prevention, public education, investigation, stroke prosecution. This is considered to be the best practice. Public education is vital. The public, we need a strong civil society. Civil society must stand up and they must take a viewpoint that we will not tolerate corruption. This is just a list of what should be in place. I'm not going to go through it. You'll be surprised in how many countries and how many departments we get. And there's a lot of these things that don't take place. If you look at the second last point, post-rotation whenever possible, very important, because law enforcement agents or people that work for a long time in the same place is more susceptible to corruption. That we need to have early detection strategies. We know our colleagues. We know who's driving a Maserati. We know what they earn. There must be disclosure. There are just a few examples of anti-corruption, and I'm not going to read through it. You can have a look at it. Very important, when we recruit new people, new employees, perform a background check on them. An anti-corruption strategy must focus on the organization, employees, the way they enforce, and on the stakeholders. Organizations should have codes of conduct, which should be practical and useful. The spirit of the code must be appropriate, not something that's cut and paste from something else. Look at the style of the drafting and the language that is used. Do our employees understand this? Can they take it in? Can they live it? Do we criminalize any transgression of the code, or do we attach any disciplinary consequences to it? Question is just, do you have a code of conduct? Do you know what it says? Where it is? Now, these are the values that should be contained in a code: impartiality, accountability, confidentiality, and transparency. Respect for values, and very important, the constitution of any country and the rule of law must be upheld. Because as government officials, we are in a position of trust, and therefore we should also be committed. There must be a training program on this to get stakeholders to buy in and communicate the knowledge. And we need to develop an ethical frame of mind. We often discuss things in the office or in projects, and then we say, is this right? And almost 100% of the time, we know what is right and what is wrong. New employees should be monitoring. There is a question, should we do integrity testing? A pre-employment screening essential. The implementation of gift and declaration policies. I got a gift once in 1989. It was a golf book, and I had to declare it. I think it was, at the time, it cost something like 14 or 15 rand. Still, one has to declare that. Very important, whistleblowers need to be protected. We currently in South Africa, we have the situation of whistleblowers that are feeling that they are not protected properly. Therefore, institutions should have a whistleblowing policy in place. People should feel safe to report. I read last week sometime about 4 or 5 people that were whistleblowers in this whole Cape capturing saga in South Africa, who has lost their jobs, they have no income, and one person was now approached by a government parastatal. They will start entering into talks with them. The perceptions of the fate of whistleblowers is portrayed by this caricature. It was already pending 2002. You did the right thing, so naturally we will have to fire you. Very important, if there are incidents of corruption, it must be recorded. The progress with the investigation must be tracked and continuous feedback must be given. Continuous risk assessment, reports must be issued, and ethics management need to be monitored constantly. I'm going to close with a few slides. We're almost there. This is something that very much speaks for itself. And this is how we should evolve in the worlds of ethics, professionalism, and anti-corruption into something nice, not like this, where we evolve into something nice, but then we turn into a pig again. With that, I thank you for your attention. Hello, Michael.
Hi, Prof.
Can I ask for questions?
Yeah. If anyone's got a question for Prof and us, now be the time. I can ask you just to raise your hand through the MS Teams, and then we can take your questions. Thank you.
Okay, it seems that there are no questions.
There's one question. Sorry, there's one question. Thank you, okay. Ezekiel.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity. Prof, I just want to find out from you, is there a lobby? Are you lobbying the government departments and agencies and to make sure that we standardize something of this nature? Because what you just explained from the onset, it is exactly what is happening, whereby people, the ethics and the moral are there. You mention every point you just pointed, nepotism and everything is exactly what is happening. People, they don't what mechanism are there to make sure that you lobby the government and agencies to make sure that we see these things as a serious matter so that it can be implemented by each and every party to this FishFORCE, because at the end of the day, we don't want, I think the time of talking is gone now. We need to implement and make sure that those found to be on the wrong side are removed from the system so that we can build our reputation and also bring back the confidence which the communities or the people, the users, they already lost confidence on us. So what are the mechanisms in place to make So that these go to the principals, the DGs, the CEO of different agencies and departments. Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Ezekiel. Look, we've got a multi-pronged approach. Almost at every conference or workshop that we organize, we have something on corruption, ethics, professionalism. From a professionalism point of view, we've got a strong advocacy amongst government departments where we promote the appointment of people that are trained, and that appointment and promotions are linked to qualifications and experience. Then we also feed in through Operation Pakisa, where most of the government departments are represented, and also through SADC, where we are part of the SADC, one of the SADC sub projects. So we try as far as we can and if we look at the training material that we develop, in most of this, we touch on, even if it's not the focus of a particular module, we touch on some form of ethics, some form of professionalism, anti-corruption, and then try and disseminate that as far as we can. We are also now, we've received funding from the UNODC in terms of the E4J project, where this matter will be addressed in South Africa. We are building a network of people that can drive Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, and Mauritius.
Thanks, Ezekiel. I see there's another question for DeCarlo. Thank you.
Hello, Prof.
Morning.
Yes, morning. Prof, when you were mentioning or giving example of the Eastern Cape case and the Western Cape case that were given different judgments, my question is, in many cases that I've been, they tend to question the issue of the use of guidelines versus, in your knowledge, which one would you advise that we need to take into consideration as fishery control officers? Because I think there's a trick line between guidelines and standard operation procedure. Thank you.
Are you talking about sentencing guidelines?
Yes, sentencing guidelines. Yes, Prof.
It's a very difficult topic because every case, we can't prescribe to the courts what they must take into consideration. But I think what is very important is for the fisheries control officer to bring the impact and the essence, and especially the societal impact, bring it under the attention of the prosecutor, so that the prosecutor can introduce it in evidence to the court. And that's where, you know, the practitioner knows what is the impact of large-scale theft that's taking place. What is the impact on communities, and that information needs to be put before the court for a decision to be made as far as sentencing is concerned. And maybe that duty on a fisheries control officer can be included in the standard operational procedure. This is standard. When I'm dealing with a matter, I'm going to give this information to the prosecutor. You will remember, I don't know whether you saw it, but in this year, we developed a standardized statement for fisheries control officers in South Africa that they can offer to prosecutors and investigating officers.
Well, thanks, Prof.
Thank you, Ezekiel. I see there's a question from Andrew.
Prof, hey, good to hear. What a wonderful presentation. I sent you an email. This presentation should go viral. I don't know how much research you have done on the sea fishery vessels that we have got here. and the frightening issues behind that. I'm in contact with fishery vessel before it was taken away from him. He was in the private industry, and the court case that Khalid Peterson, I think she was in charge of DAF at that stage, had against him because of the sea fishery vessels and how long those sea fisheries vessels stood in Simonstown Harbour. And then he was accused of putting seawater in the fuel tanks of the sea fisheries vessels from the DAF people. So, you know, it's coming from the top. And if you can't sort out the top, how the hell are you going to sort this thing out?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Yes, we've done research on vessels on the high seas and in the EEZ, not on that particular issue, but I know there are cases pending with regard to that. But you're welcome to send me an email. We realize that, you know, the large quantities that are stolen happens on sea, and for that purpose we've now partnered with Operation Pakisa and DEF as it is now, and we in the last week of January we will start with a program dealing with the Port States Measures Agreement, so that we can implement the Port States Measures Agreement fully in South Africa. And in that, there will then be an increased monitoring of international IUU vessels, and they will be controlled when they enter our harbors and EEZ and so on. So yes, we're looking wider now, not just poaching or land-based poaching, but we're looking at preventing or contributing to preventing IUU fishing or fisheries crime on the high seas. We must just remember these things are often linked to other crimes such as human trafficking. If we look at the Blighnout case here in the Eastern Cape, there were also 2 Chinese officials that were basically trafficked to work in processing plants. And there was also drugs involved. People were paid with drugs and not with money. And this often happens in other areas as well. But thank you for that input.
Any other further questions from anyone? Okay, if not any further questions, I think we can close. So thanks everyone for attending. We appreciate you taking the time, and as mentioned in the beginning, we will share the link to the recording as well as the presentation will be made available for those that want to download it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everybody.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.